Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. Today is another episode of procrastinating my truck build. Not really. We're building the transmission today, or this week, or 2 weeks, however long it takes. Anyways, let's just jump right into it. We are gonna start this by building the output shaft. This has all the gears that are switched between whenever you switch the gears. And the first thing we need to do is reassemble all of the synchros with the clutches. So we're gonna build 3 of them. We'll start by building these. I have a little bit of assembly lube and oil just to put on the parts as I assemble them. When assembling this, you're gonna have your 2 new synchros. You're gonna have 3 centering guides, you're gonna have 2 snap rings, and you're gonna have the inner and the outer parts of the clutch. The first thing to do is drop the inner into the outer. This does have an alignment from my old pictures. As you can see, there's teeth for the reverse gear on one side and a rib on the other side. If you put the rib down and then look at the inner part, there's a groove on one side and a groove not on the other side. So groove goes up with the rib down. That's what she said. Slide these together, and then there are 3 locations that these centering guides drop into. And then drop a snap ring in. Flip it over and put the other snap ring in. On the synchros, because these are new, it doesn't matter what side you put them on, but once you put them in, they will mate with the corresponding gear and they will officially live together. There are 3 notches. Those 3 notches align with the 3 of those guides. And when you have it in correctly, the synchro can only move a couple degrees back and forth, and that is on purpose. So align the other one, and your first synchro is now together. Now grab the next clutch with the 2 synchros and do the exact same thing. There is an alignment to this one as well. There is a chamfer on one edge and a relief cut on the other side. In the build, the chamfer is down as far as my stack goes. We'll get to that later, but the chamfer has the side of the inside with the chamfer on this part right here. You can see here, there's a nice sharp edge. It's a 90-degree cut. This edge has a chamfer on it. So chamfer goes with chamfer. Oh, and when you assemble these guys, there's a little nub that sticks out. The nub goes outwards. The last one is slightly different than the other 2. It only has 1 synchro, and the inner part of the clutch is actually part of the 5th gear. This one's relatively easy to get together. To put this one together correctly, you can see on the clutch, one side is flat, the other side has rounded teeth. The rounded teeth need to go towards the direction of the synchro, so that means they are pointed up. The guides are asymmetric as well. They have a taper on one side. That taper goes down into the 5th gear. Again, with the little nub out. The two snap rings go both on the same side and misalign them by 120 or 60 degrees. The synchro, again, drops on, it'll find its home, it'll rock back and forth, and you can drop this piece on. I now have all of the parts for the output shaft laid out. So we have third gear and its bearing, the clutch pack with the synchros, we have fourth gear with its bearing, we have a spacer, we have another bearing, fifth gear, spacer, and the last bearing. In between those, we have snap rings that will go on accordingly. And one of the most important parts is making sure that this itty bitty little pin gets installed in the shaft in a hole right here so that this stays stationary and does not rub against the bearing, but rubs against the oil surface between the fourth gear and this. So we'll start by grabbing the third gear and its synchro, aligning them correctly on top of the pipe, and then tapping it in. And with the third gear and the clutch slightly tapped onto the spline, I am going to drop it into the sleeve and then go over to my press and press it on. One thing to note is I do not have this other synchro in place because I don't want to risk damaging it. So I'm just going to be pressing on this inner lip right here, which will be completely fine. With the clutch pressed together, we can see that the first snap ring needs to go in the screw right here. And I do believe it is this one, and I'm not sure the best way to get that installed. Back of a hammer. And we'll keep on stacking. So I just took this thing apart after putting together, and if you drop the bearing on and then the fourth gear on, there's a recess here. You can see that where my finger is to the tip, there's like space. And that is where the plastic comes in. And that goes in line with this bearing. But it doesn't go on top. If you pull off the gear, you can see here, the polished surface goes all the way to the edge. You can see on the other side, the polished surface stops about the thickness of the spacer. So, pulling the bearing off, putting the spacer on, putting the gear on. That bearing is now flush with the surface of the gear. So we can continue to stack things up and get the rest of this assembled. The next thing is this thrust bearing, and it has the hole for this alignment pin. It looks like there's witness marks on the outside that kind of resemble the same diameter as the inside of this thrust surface. And we're gonna put some assembly lube on this part, which I probably should have put some on the thrust bearing all the way down here, but we'll spin this slowly, get some oil, lubricate it through everything before we actually get some miles on it. It'll all be fine. All right, just double checking with my reference photos. The next thing is the bearing, which will get pressed on. Make sure you have this groove in the bearing facing away from the fourth gear. You want this groove away from the fourth gear towards the fifth gear. Because I don't want to be putting any pressure on the outside race, I'm going to press these two together since the 2-inch shaft fits perfectly around this gear. So I'm going to get it in the press and press this together. And the last thing to do is to assemble second gear. And to assemble second gear, it's the same as the other side. Just follow your reference pictures, press everything together in little groups, and everything should go together just fine. So what you saw me do there was gently persuade the snap ring back into the groove. It had slightly warped when I took it out, so it wasn't completely flush with the surface. And once I got this corner right here on, it all just kind of started to fit into place. So I wasn't manhandling anything, I wasn't forcing anything. I was just kind of flattening the snap ring so that it went into this groove. And with that, the output shaft is assembled. The only thing we need to do is put the bearing on the input shaft, put on the snap ring, and then we can slide the two together with this bearing. When pressing this other large bearing on the input shaft, be sure to have the groove away from the gear. Now with the intermediate gear, I'm going to hold it up against the input and the output shaft and make sure that all of the gears mesh. What I'm doing is lining up the fourth gear with the fourth gear here at the same height, and then I am checking to make sure that all the other gears line up, and they all do. So I assembled the input and the output shaft together correctly. With the input and the output shaft assembled, the next thing to do before we put everything into the housing is to assemble the intermediate shaft. And the only thing I can do here before putting it into the transmission housing is to press this bearing on this end. This bearing has an inner race that pulls out. It has writing on the race that pulls out. There's a sleeve on the other side that does not have writing on it. This goes on the shaft first, and then the bearing with the groove away from the gear, along with the inner race with the shoulder on the outside. And my reference pictures show the label on the inner race here. So that's why the shoulder, the separate part, this part, goes on first. With all of the shafts put together, we have the output shaft, the intermediate shaft is down here, the input shaft, and the reverse gear with the shaft. All of this now needs to go into the chassis of the transmission. I have it clamped into a vise. All of the weight's going to be hanging off of this side. That's why it's put in the vise this direction. I have 3 pieces of wood that are protecting the paint job. So now I just need to install everything. The first step in this is to put the output shaft in. And this simply goes in here. With that installed, we can now install the snap ring. The next step is to install the input shaft with the intermediate shaft. And I have yet to install the bearing on. This will go in after the intermediate shaft and input shaft are installed. So this is going to be a little tricky. Since this bearing is buried inside the shaft and it's going to take a moment for oil to get to it, I'm going to go ahead and give it some assembly lube just to help it out in the beginning. The intermediate shaft goes in next, and it should mate up with all of the gears. With that in, slide in the other bearing. Now install the reverse gear. And on the reverse gear shaft, you can see that there's this notch. That notch is important. We now need to install this plate. The 2 snap rings are in, the shaft is in. Put this over. Rotate this down and install some partners. With all of the shafts installed in the chassis, the last thing to do is to install the 5th gear drive. Phooey. Take 2. So I made a mistake. I think you're supposed to put this bearing on after it's all assembled, but I did figure out a way to get it together in its current form. It just takes some patience and finesse and not mucking anything up. So back to it again. First thing we got to do, install the output shaft. It doesn't have to be in its final position, it just needs to be in the housing. All right, now this is where things get kind of complicated. The only thing you don't have to worry about right now is this itty bitty little bearing that locates this ring. We can get to that. But everything else kind of needs to go together at once. So I still have the bearing with some assembly grease in. I'm gonna go ahead and stick that on. Now, before we put the bearing in the housing, we're going to partially put the intermediate shaft in. Get it kind of lined up and held in place. We're going to put the bearing on. We're going to slide the thrust washer on with the wide part out. We're going to put the 5th gear on, and to get that on, you have to back this up a little bit. Now with that on, again, put the intermediate shaft through, get this bearing onto its race. So now, rotate the shaft until the ball bearing groove is shown. Drop it in. Line up the thrust washer. A little assembly lube. Half of the bearing. Other half of the bearing. Shit. I forgot this part. This plate in. I can still get the bearing in. I can get this away and get the snap ring in. I can get the input shaft in because it moves out of the way. Okay, back together. Who needs a stupid tool? Snap ring is in. We are going to put 1 screw in, 2 screws in. We're going to bring the gear up. We're going to slide 1 bearing in. We're going to slide the other bearing in. That fully mates now. Oh, I hope this works. Woo-wee! Alrighty, so I need to go buy a 32mm socket to finish putting this on because I don't want to be using the adjustable wrench and making sure the synchro gets seated on correctly. So I need to do that tomorrow morning. The rest of the gears feel absolutely wonderful. I mean, all of the gears feel wonderful. You can spin each one. There's no binding, there's no mess. You can shift reverse in. Now it's spinning backwards. This will get fixed when these are spaced correctly. But I think I'm going to stop this video here. I feel like it's probably gotten a little bit long, but we have successfully put the transmission, at least the gears, back together. Next week, we will start on all of the shifting, which is all these holes over here and all the shift forks over there, and we will get it closed up. Thank you for coming along. I hope you enjoyed this journey. I had a lot of fun finally getting this back together. It looks and feels wonderful. If you are new to the channel and like what you're seeing, I would love it if you went ahead and subscribed. If you want to get notifications, you can go ahead and click the bell. You can also follow me on Instagram at NabbleRabble. And I think that's about it for this, guys. Thanks for tuning in. I really do appreciate you coming along on this journey, and I will see you soon. Bye guys.